Chapter 1. The Calm Before the Storm. It was just after dawn when the first light of the day began creeping through the large windows of Eli's cafe, casting soft beams across the polished wooden floors. The air was thick with the scent of freshly brewed coffee, a rich, earthy aroma that filled the quiet corners of the cafe. There was something peaceful about mornings like this. The bustle of the city hadn't fully begun, and those who wandered into the cafe were few, content to nurse their cups and enjoy a quiet moment before the noise of the world came rushing back. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson walked through the door, the slight jingle of the bell above it breaking the silence. He wore a black baseball cap pulled low, casting a shadow over his eyes, and dark sunglasses, the kind of accessory you'd wear to go unnoticed in a crowd. He didn't want the attention. Not today. He wasn't here to make a scene, just to enjoy a cup of coffee and escape the press of his busy schedule for a moment. As he entered, the comforting warmth of the cafe wrapped around him like a familiar embrace. The place was cozy, tucked between two taller buildings in the heart of downtown Chicago, a haven of rustic charm amidst the urban chaos. Wooden tables dotted the space, and the walls were lined with eclectic artwork from local artists, each piece telling its own story. There was a hum of conversation, the kind that filled the background but never threatened to take over. The soft clink of cups and saucers blended seamlessly with the sound of the espresso machine at work. He moved toward the counter where a young woman stood, her energy a stark contrast to the peaceful atmosphere that hung over the room. Her name was Ava, and she wore a broad smile as she greeted him. "Good morning. What can I get for you today?" Her voice was cheerful, bright, a tone that made you feel welcome even in the early hours of the morning. Dwayne adjusted his cap slightly, glancing over the menu on the chalkboard behind her. He didn't need much. He had a busy day ahead, but he could spare a few minutes for this quiet escape. "I'll take a black coffee, please," he said, sliding a $5 bill across the counter. His voice was low, smooth, the kind that could command a room even in the softest of tones. Ava nodded with a friendly smile, taking the bill and setting it aside as she moved to prepare the coffee. She was quick, her movements efficient and practiced. The cafe was her home, a place where she could get lost in the routine of making drinks, exchanging pleasantries with the regulars, and, when the occasion arose, offering a kind word to someone in need. Dwayne took a seat by the window, choosing a spot where the light hit just right. He let out a quiet sigh as he gazed out at the streets below. The city was just beginning to stir. People in suits rushed by, unaware of the quiet world inside the cafe. It was peaceful here, away from the constant flash of cameras and the whirlwind of his fame. For now, he could pretend to be just another man enjoying a cup of coffee. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the cafe door opening with a loud creak, followed by the heavy stomp of boots on the wooden floor. Dwayne's eyes shifted toward the door, instinctively noting the three figures who entered. They were unmistakable, a group of bikers, rough around the edges with their leather jackets, tattoos, and the unmistakable air of entitlement that followed them. The leader, a tall man with a scruffy beard and dark sunglasses, scanned the room, his gaze lingering on the customers in the cafe. There was a smirk on his lips, like he was always looking for something to pick at, something to make him feel more powerful. Dwayne's gaze remained neutral. He wasn't here for trouble, and he wasn't going to start anything. He sipped his coffee, letting the warmth settle in his hands, but he kept an eye on the bikers. They had an aura about them, the kind that made you feel like you should be on alert just in case. Well, the leader said, his voice loud and brash, clearly meant to draw attention. "Look at this. A little cafe with a little mascot behind the counter." He gestured to Ava, who was busy preparing drinks, but seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. "Did they hire someone off the street today?" His words were laced with mockery, and his companion snickered, feeding off his attitude. Ava, without missing a beat, looked up from the counter. Her smile didn't waver, though there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She had dealt with this kind of attitude before, and she wasn't about to let it throw her off track. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said, her tone professional but calm. "What can I get for you today?" The leader's eyes narrowed, studying her for a moment before he scoffed. "I don't think I want anything from someone like you," he sneered, looking her up and down. You never know what people like her might put in your drink, he added, his voice dripping with disdain. His friends laughed loudly, their voices cutting through the air with a sense of cruel amusement. Ava didn't flinch. Her jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. She had learned long ago that not everyone was going to be kind, and the best thing she could do was rise above it. If you'd like to place an order, she said, her voice steady, I'll take it. If not, I'll ask you to let the other customers enjoy their morning. The leader's eyes darkened at her response. His smile twisted into something far colder, and he leaned forward, his voice low and threatening. Listen, girl, he growled, people like you need to know their place. And your place? It's cleaning up after us and keeping your mouth shut. Got it. Ava met his gaze with unwavering calm. I don't want trouble, she said softly, but I won't tolerate this kind of behavior. The words hung in the air for a moment, and just as the tension was about to escalate further, something changed. There was a deep, steady voice that cut through the rising tension, a voice that demanded respect simply by existing. That's enough. The bikers turned, their faces momentarily puzzled, and then surprised as they saw who was speaking. Standing just behind them, his towering figure casting a shadow across the cafe floor, was Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. He had risen from his seat, his presence commanding attention without the need for a single word more than what he had already spoken. The leader of the bikers turned toward him, his smirk returning. And who the hell are you supposed to be? He sneered, pointing his finger at Dwayne. Some kind of hero. Dwayne's expression was calm, his stance unflinching. He didn't flinch at the taunt, didn't back away. I'm someone who doesn't tolerate bullies, he said, his voice firm but not raised. Put the knife down and leave now. The bikers laughed at him, as expected, but Dwayne didn't move. He just stood there waiting. The challenge had been made, and with that, the stage was set for the storm to come. Chapter 2, The Bikers' Challenge. The laughter of the bikers echoed through the cafe, bouncing off the walls and filling the air with a sense of reckless bravado. Rick, the leader of the group, looked at Dwayne like he was a nuisance, a fly buzzing in his face that needed to be swatted away. The two bikers flanking him exchanged knowing glances, amused at the thought of this stranger, thinking he could stand up to them. Dwayne remained perfectly still, his gaze unwavering, as if his very presence was enough to make the room settle. The tension in the air, thick and palpable, hung between them like a storm cloud, just waiting to burst. Rick took a step toward Dwayne, his eyes narrowing as he sized him up. The biker's lips twisted into a sneer, and he folded his arms across his chest. What are you going to do, big guy? Rick mocked, the sarcasm in his voice dripping like venom. You think you're some kind of superhero? He laughed again, the sound hollow, like he didn't even care to hear the answer. Dwayne didn't flinch. He knew better than to rise to the bait. I'm not looking for a fight, he said, his tone even and calm. But if you don't leave, I'm going to make you. His voice was firm, the kind of voice that made people stop and think twice, even if they didn't want to admit it. The two other bikers chuckled behind Rick. Leaning against the counter, their arms crossed. One of them, a lanky man with a sharp jawline and blonde hair, shook his head as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Oh, look at this guy, the blonde biker scoffed, his laugh still loud and mocking. What's next? Are you going to arrest us with that coffee cup? His words were full of contempt, clearly thinking this confrontation was just some kind of joke. Dwayne's eyes didn't leave Rick's. He knew exactly what was happening. They were testing him, pushing him to see if they could make him snap. But Dwayne wasn't going to let them have the satisfaction. The calm in his demeanor was a shield, and he wasn't about to let them shatter it. Rick stepped forward again, his boots scraping against the floor. The knife in his hand glinted as it caught the light, and Dwayne's gaze flickered momentarily to the weapon. It was just a flicker, but enough to let the bikers know that Dwayne wasn't scared. You think you can intimidate me? Rick snarled, his voice low and dangerous now, no longer playful. I don't care who you are. I'll show you what happens when you stand up to me. Ava, still standing behind the counter, her hands gripping the edge tightly, watched the exchange with wide eyes. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she didn't dare look away. She could feel the weight of the situation hanging over them. She knew it was bad, But she also knew there was nothing she could do to stop it, at least nothing that would keep her from making things worse. But she wasn't alone anymore. Dwayne was here. For a split second, there was nothing but silence. The other customers in the cafe held their breath, the air thick with anticipation. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like time had stopped, like the world had paused just for a moment to see what would happen next. Rick's hand twitched, tightening around the hilt of his knife. He was ready to make a move. And then it happened. In one fluid motion, Dwayne moved forward. His body shifted with the precision of a well-oiled machine. The bikers didn't have time to react. Dwayne's hand shot out like a lightning bolt, grabbing Rick's wrist with such force that the knife was wrenched from his hand. The blade clattered to the floor with a loud, sharp sound, but Dwayne didn't flinch. He held Rick's arm steady, keeping the biker in place. Rick let out a startled yell, stumbling back. His companions, momentarily stunned, hesitated. They had expected a confrontation, but not like this. Dwayne stood tall, his hand still holding Rick's wrist as he kept the biker at arm's length. "You should have listened," Dwayne said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "Leave. Now." The blonde biker, who had been laughing before, took a step forward, his expression changing from amusement to anger. "What the hell, man?" he shouted, his voice rising. "You can't just—" Before he could finish a sentence, Dwayne shifted his weight and moved with the same controlled precision, using the blonde biker's momentum against him. In a move that was almost too quick to follow, Dwayne twisted the biker's arm and sent him sprawling onto the floor with a loud thud. The sound of the impact reverberated through the cafe, and for a brief moment, everything was silent again. The third biker, who had been standing slightly apart from the others, finally moved. His face was a mixture of hesitation and anger, but he still charged at Dwayne, fists clenched. Ava held her breath, gripping the counter with white knuckles, knowing what was coming next. Dwayne didn't even blink. He ducked under the man's wild punch, his body flowing with the grace of a trained fighter. In a swift, seamless movement, Dwayne grabbed the man's arm and twisted it behind his back. The biker grunted in pain, his knees buckling as he was forced forward into the counter, slamming against it with a harsh crack. The cafe was filled with the sound of chaos, the clatter of chairs being pushed back, the shuffling of people moving out of the way, the distant hum of street traffic outside. A few customers had pulled out their phones, recording the scene, while others stood frozen, too shocked to do anything but watch. Ava, who had been a mere bystander until now, felt a strange mix of relief and awe. She had been afraid of what might happen, but now she couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. Dwayne had stepped in without hesitation, saving her from something far worse. The bikers were on the floor now, humiliated and defeated. Their leader groaned as he pushed himself up, his face flushed with anger. "You think you've won?" Rick spat, wiping the blood from his lip. "You haven't seen the last of us." Dwayne stood over them, his posture calm and controlled, but his eyes glinted with a quiet warning. "You've already lost," he said, his voice low, cold. "Get up, leave, and don't come back." Rick's gaze shot daggers at him, but there was nothing left in his eyes now but shame. Without another word, the bikers scrambled to their feet and rushed toward the door, their steps hurried, their heads low in defeat. The cafe slowly began to settle again, the adrenaline still thick in the air. Ava exhaled, her body finally relaxing as the tension lifted. She glanced at Dwayne, who was already moving back toward the counter, his presence still commanding the room even as he walked away. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice shaky but sincere. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." "You didn't need me," Dwayne interrupted, his smile small but genuine. "You handled yourself just fine." But Ava couldn't shake the feeling that she would never forget this moment, not just because of what Dwayne had done, but because she had learned something today. She had the strength to stand up for herself, too. Chapter 3. The line is crossed. The cafe was still humming with life after the bikers had been escorted out, but the tension in the air hadn't quite dissipated. The regulars, a few of whom had been watching the confrontation unfold with wide eyes, now exchanged glances and quiet murmurs. Some were still holding their phones, unsure whether they had witnessed something extraordinary or just the beginning of something dangerous. But for all the chaos, Ava stood behind the counter, trying to steady her breathing. Her hands trembled slightly as she wiped away the last of the coffee stains from her apron, but she refused to let the fear settle in her chest. She had done it. She had stood her ground. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson had stepped in, his presence a force that demanded respect. And for that, she was grateful. But she also knew this wasn't over. The way Rick and his crew had looked at her, like she was a target, like she was less than them, had left an imprint she couldn't ignore. The bikers had walked out, but the sting of their words and actions lingered. As Dwayne made his way back to the counter, the door swung open again. The same bell that had announced the bikers' entrance rang once more, and the room quieted, anticipating another disturbance. This time, however, it wasn't the bikers returning in anger. The door opened to reveal the officer from the earlier encounter, his badge catching the morning light. He wasn't alone. The police presence in the cafe, though the relief, only seemed to bring more scrutiny. It was clear now that the morning's events would be discussed at length, not just by the customers, but by the authorities as well. The officer walked up to Dwayne, nodding respectfully. "Mr. Johnson," the officer said with a slight grin, "I'm glad you were here this morning. We've had some trouble with that group for a while." His eyes shifted toward Ava, who was still standing behind the counter. "Are you all right?" Ava nodded, though she felt the weight of the officer's question press against her chest. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady but quieter than usual. "Thanks to him." She gestured toward Dwayne, who stood at her side with his arms crossed, looking calm despite the recent events. "I just did what anyone would do," Dwayne said, his deep voice smooth as he glanced at Ava, a reassuring smile tugging at his lips. "People like that," he gestured to the door where the bikers had exited, "don't get to push others around without consequences." Ava could feel the sincerity in his words, and it struck her deeply. In the years she had worked here, she'd learned to shrug off insults, to let things slide, to keep her head down and just do her job. But today was different. Today, she had been forced to confront her own boundaries and push back. And in doing so, she had found herself standing taller, stronger than she had ever expected. As the police officer took her statement, Dwayne's presence seemed to put everyone at ease. The customers, still a bit wide-eyed from the confrontation, resumed their conversations, though quieter, more subdued now, like they were aware they had just witnessed something that didn't happen every day. The murmurs around the room shifted from disbelief to admiration. A few even came up to Ava, offering words of encouragement. "You did good." One of the regulars, an older woman who always ordered her coffee black, said with a nod. "You stood up for yourself. Not everyone has the guts for that." Ava forced a smile, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. "Thanks," she said softly, her voice still carrying that tremor of lingering shock. Another man, one of the younger patrons who had been sitting at the back of the cafe, came up to the counter, his face a mixture of respect and curiosity. "That was something," he said, eyes wide. "You okay?" "I mean, you were calm, but I don't know if I could have kept my cool like that." Ava's gaze dropped to the counter for a moment. She couldn't quite put into words how she felt, but what the man said was true. She had kept her composure, but it was only now, with the threat gone, that she felt the exhaustion of it all creeping into her bones. "Yeah," she finally said, looking up again and meeting his gaze. "I think I am." The police officer, having taken Ava's statement, looked over at Dwayne, giving him a nod. "I'll be in touch if we need anything else," he said, tapping his notepad. "You handled the situation well, Mr. Johnson. We'll handle the rest from here." Dwayne gave a polite nod, his expression briefly softening. "Good luck," he said to the officer before turning back to Ava. "You should take a break," he suggested, his voice gentler now, as though sensing the tension that still lingered in her. "You've earned it." Ava opened her mouth to protest, but then realized that he was right. The events of the morning had shaken her more than she had admitted to herself, and the adrenaline rush that had kept her going now seemed to be fading, leaving a quiet, unsettling fatigue in its place. She looked at the clock. It was almost time for the lunch rush, but she didn't think she could face it just yet. Not after everything that had happened. "Maybe I will," she said quietly, offering him a small but genuine smile. She felt like she needed a moment to collect herself, to regain some semblance of calm before the cafe became crowded again. She looked at Dwayne. "Thanks for everything." "You don't need to thank me," Dwayne said, giving her a small smile in return. "You were the one who stood up to them, not me." Ava met his gaze, and for the first time that day, she felt a sense of real strength. She had done something for herself. She had taken control of the situation, and though it had been terrifying, she had come out on the other side with her head held high. It was a small victory, but it was hers. As she moved to take a seat in the back, the door to the cafe opened again, and the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance. The bikers, it seemed, were not quite finished with their reckoning. The world outside was moving forward with all its noise and chaos. But for Ava, there was something grounding in this moment, a quiet reminder that she could handle whatever came next. She had crossed a line today, one that had been drawn long ago in her mind, a line that had kept her from speaking up for so long. But now, the line was gone, and in its place, there was only clarity. She could stand her ground. She could make a difference. The cafe was slowly returning to its usual rhythm, the tension that had hung in the air dissipating like fog under the warmth of the midday sun. Ava glanced at Dwayne one last time, who was now seated at a nearby table, his own cup of coffee in hand. He gave her a small nod of acknowledgement, and she returned it with a slight tilt of her head. And in that moment, Ava knew that no matter what happened next, she wasn't going to let anyone push her down again. The line had been crossed, and she was stronger for it. Chapter 4, The Rock Stand. The cafe had barely returned to normal when the door swung open again. But this time, it wasn't the chaotic force of bikers coming back for a round two. Instead, it was the unsettling silence that followed the few officers who stepped in, their faces serious, already surveying the scene. Ava took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, but the quiet buzz of tension still lingered in the air, like the lingering aftertaste of a bitter argument. The sound of footsteps echoed against the floor as a few more officers filtered in. Dwayne, who had settled back into his chair by the window, wasn't about to let the situation escalate again. His eyes had been following the arrival of the officers, the way they exchanged hushed words with the regulars. The bikers had been dealt with, but the ripple effect of their presence still echoed through the cafe. The last thing anyone needed now was for the situation to get worse, for the bikers to come back, emboldened by the humiliation they'd just endured. The officer from earlier, a stern but professional figure, made his way over to Dwayne. There was a faint recognition in his eyes now, more than there had been before. He had obviously realized the magnitude of what had just taken place. "Mr. Johnson," he started, his voice low but respectful. "Thanks for stepping in. It's not every day we see someone handle a situation like that." Dwayne nodded once, his expression unchanged. He was still digesting the events of the morning, but his mind was now focused on keeping the peace. "Glad I could help," Dwayne said, his voice even and calm. "But the truth is, they should have never crossed the line with her." He motioned subtly toward Ava, who was still behind the counter, wiping down surfaces. He caught her eye briefly, offering a quiet smile. "No one should have to put up with that." Ava gave him a small nod in return, the warmth of his words offering her a small measure of reassurance. But despite the calm exterior, there was a restless energy bubbling within her, an unshakable feeling that things weren't truly settled yet. It was in the air, thick, heavy, like the calm before a storm. The bikers had left, yes, but something about the way the leader had looked at her as he stormed out of the cafe kept her on edge. The scorn, the hatred in his eyes, it didn't sit right with her. As the officers continued to question Dwayne about the specifics of the confrontation, a few of the regulars approached Ava, offering her small words of support. She nodded, muttering thanks, but her thoughts kept drifting back to what had happened before. The bikers had humiliated her in front of the cafe's customers, and despite Dwayne's intervention, there was a part of her that felt like it wasn't over. It never really was, not for someone like her. She knew that if people like Rick could get away with it once, they might try again. She wasn't going to wait around to find out. "Are you sure you're okay?" one of the customers asked, his voice genuine but soft, as though afraid to press too much. He was an older man, one of the regulars who always came in for his morning coffee. His weathered face had an expression of quiet concern as he watched her, waiting for her to open up. Ava gave him a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her calm facade. "Just needed a minute." The man nodded sympathetically, his hands wrapped around his cup of coffee. "You've got guts, I'll tell you that. Not everyone would have stood their ground like you did." She gave a small, grateful nod. "Thanks." But just as she felt a brief moment of calm settling back over her, she heard the unmistakable sound of heavy boots hitting the cafe floor. The door creaked open, and in walked the bikers, Rick and his two companions. The laughter, the sneers, the looks of disdain, they returned with the same swagger that had filled the room before. Only this time, there was something different in their eyes. It was anger, pure and unfiltered, and it was aimed directly at her. Rick stepped into the cafe with a forceful, almost menacing presence. He scanned the room, his gaze briefly locking with Dwayne's before shifting toward Ava. His eyes were full of fury. "You think you've won, don't you?" he spat, his voice low and filled with malice. "You think just because you have someone to protect you, everything is going to be okay?" His lips curled into a sneer as he looked around at the people in the cafe who had witnessed what had just happened. Ava's heart skipped a beat, the cold rush of fear running through her veins. She had hoped that the encounter had been finished, that the bikers would go off and lick their wounds. But they weren't done. Not yet. Dwayne stood, his towering presence blocking Rick from taking another step. "You need to leave," he said, his voice deep and unwavering, filled with authority. "This isn't your place anymore." Rick took a step toward Dwayne, his fists clenched, and for a moment, it seemed like everything was about to explode. But the other two bikers, who had been standing at the door, looked uncertain. They glanced at their leader, then back at Dwayne. They clearly didn't want to escalate things further, but their pride and arrogance wouldn't let them back down without one last word. "You think you could just walk in here and intimidate us?" Rick hissed, the knife that had been discarded earlier now reappearing in his hand. The glint of the blade caught the light as he held it up, his eyes challenging Dwayne to make a move. Dwayne's posture shifted, and for a moment, there was a chilling silence. Then, with a sudden and deliberate movement, Dwayne took a step forward, cutting the space between them in an instant. The bikers didn't know what hit them. With a swift, practiced motion, he grabbed Rick's arm, twisting it so quickly that the knife clattered to the floor before Rick could react. The other two bikers, who had been ready to charge, hesitated as Dwayne moved with ease and precision. There was no bravado in him now, no showmanship, just pure, calm strength. The power he held was in his control, in his ability to make every move count without ever needing to throw a punch unnecessarily. Rick, now disarmed and clearly rattled, stumbled backward, his breath heavy. His companions moved back too, their faces full of disbelief. "That's it," Dwayne said quietly, his voice steady, though there was an unmistakable edge to it. "You've lost. Now get out of here before things get worse for you." For a moment, it seemed like Rick was going to make another move, but he caught Dwayne's gaze and something in his expression shifted. Whatever pride he had left drained away, and with one last hateful glare toward Ava, he nodded to his companions. The three bikers retreated out of the cafe, leaving behind the tension that had once filled the room. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ava stood frozen behind the counter, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins, her heart pounding in her chest. The cafe had witnessed a confrontation unlike any other, one that was not defined by violence, but by the sheer force of will, by the calm strength that Dwayne had shown. It wasn't just about protecting her, it was about standing up for what was right. As the bikers disappeared down the street, Dwayne turned back toward Ava, his expression softening. "You all right?" he asked, his voice no longer commanding, but warm, concerned. Ava nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, I think I am." The cafe, still buzzing with the energy of what had just unfolded, began to return to a semblance of normalcy. But for Ava, things would never be the same. She had crossed the line, and she wasn't going to let anyone push her back across it. As the sunlight filtered through the windows, Dwayne turned to leave, giving Ava one last nod. He didn't need to say anything more. She understood. Chapter 5. Aftermath and Resolution. The cafe slowly began to settle into a quiet rhythm once again, though there was still an air of disbelief hanging over the customers. The bikers had been escorted away by the police, their humiliation evident in the way they had walked out, heads low, bodies slouched in defeat. Some of the regulars were still whispering among themselves, replaying the moment when Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson had intervened with such calm precision. To them, it wasn't just an act of physical strength, but a reminder of something deeper, the power of standing up against injustice, of not letting the bullies have the last word. Ava stood behind the counter, her movements slower now as she cleaned up the remnants of the morning's chaos. The coffee stains on her apron were a constant reminder of what had happened, but somehow they felt different now. They weren't just stains anymore. They were marks of resilience. She had handled herself in the face of the bikers' insults, had kept her calm despite the threat of violence. And when Dwayne had stepped in, she had stood by his side, not as a victim, but as someone who could handle what life threw at her. She glanced over at Dwayne, who had returned to his seat by the window. He was still the same imposing figure, but now there was a softness to him. His smile, when he had checked on her earlier, had been genuine, the kind that told her he wasn't just a celebrity passing through. He had seen something in her, something more than just a woman working behind counter. He had seen strength, and for the first time in a long while, Ava believed it. The police officers had come and gone, taking statements from the witnesses and ensuring that the bikers wouldn't be coming back anytime soon. Ava had been asked to stay and answer a few questions, and though she was still shaken by the morning's events, she did so with a newfound sense of clarity. She didn't feel alone anymore, not with Dwayne in the room, not with the regulars offering their support. The weight of the situation had been heavy, but the aftermath felt lighter, like the first rays of sunlight after a storm. A few minutes passed, and the door creaked open again. This time, it wasn't the bikers returning for round two, nor was it the police. It was a new customer, a familiar face, one of the regulars who had witnessed the confrontation earlier. He was an older man, always a bit quiet but always kind. He approached the counter with a hesitant smile, his eyes filled with respect. "Excuse me," the man began, his voice steady but filled with admiration. "I just want to say thank you. What you did today, it meant a lot to all of us." He paused for a moment, looking over at Dwayne, who was still sitting by the window, his attention now fully on the conversation. "You too," the man added, tipping his head toward Dwayne. "You were something else out there. I've never seen anything like it." Dwayne's smile was modest, but there was a quiet pride in it. "I just did what anyone would have done," he replied, his voice smooth and sincere. "But it wasn't just me. Ava here was the real hero today. She stood her ground, didn't back down, even when they tried to break her." Ava blinked, taken aback by his words. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected him to single her out like that. The man nodded at Dwayne's words and turned back to Ava. "You showed a lot of strength, young lady," he said, his voice warm with genuine respect. "Not everyone would have handled it the way you did." Ava felt a lump form in her throat, and she swallowed it down, forcing herself to hold it together. She had always been proud of her ability to handle difficult situations, to smile through the awkward encounters, the rude customers, the insults. But today, something had changed. Today, she had confronted something she hadn't known how to deal with, her own limitations, her own fear. And in doing so, she had found something deeper within herself. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but soft. "It's just, sometimes you have to stand up. Sometimes you just can't let it slide anymore." The older man smiled, patting her hand gently as he turned to leave. "Well, I hope the rest of your day goes better. You've earned a peaceful one." Ava smiled faintly, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. Peaceful. She hadn't really thought about it that way. After everything that had happened, a peaceful day almost seemed like a luxury. The door chimed again, and more regulars filtered in, looking curiously at Ava but not saying much. They didn't need to. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a recognition of what had happened, of what had been witnessed. And for the first time, Ava didn't feel like the outsider. She didn't feel like the one who had to prove herself. She felt like part of something bigger than herself. A few minutes later, the bell chimed again, and to Ava's surprise, it was Dwayne who stood up and walked toward her. He wasn't in a hurry, just casually strolling up to the counter, his demeanor as relaxed as before. "You doing okay?" he asked, his voice kind but quiet, as though he didn't want to disturb her thoughts. Ava nodded. "Yeah, I think so." She glanced at him, then quickly looked away, feeling a bit of shyness creep in. I never thought today would go like this." Dwayne's chuckle was low and genuine. "I don't think any of us did. But sometimes life throws you a curveball. The trick is to just swing, right?" Ava smiled, feeling a brief moment of warmth in her chest. He was right. Life had a way of throwing curveballs. But today she had caught one, and she had hit out of the park. As Dwayne turned to leave, he paused by the door, his hand resting on the handle. "You know," he said, turning back slightly, "if you ever need someone to have your back again, don't hesitate to reach out. You're tougher than you think." Ava couldn't help but smile, feeling a warmth spread through her. "Thanks, I will." And with that, Dwayne stepped out into the morning sunlight, disappearing into the bustle of the city outside. The cafe was left buzzing with quiet murmurs, the atmosphere now lighter, the air fresher. The regulars had returned to their seats, some exchanging small words of encouragement, others simply drinking their coffee in silence, each person now subtly aware of the moment they had shared together. Ava stood behind the counter, her hands moving automatically as she began to prepare another cup of coffee. But her thoughts were quieter now, calmer. The chaos of the morning had left, but in its place was something more profound. She had faced down her own fears, had stood up for herself in a way she never had before. She wasn't just a barista at Eli's Cafe anymore. She was someone who could handle whatever came next. The day was just beginning, but Ava knew it was going to be okay. The line had been crossed, but she had found her strength. And for the first time in a long while, she was ready for whatever came her way.
If you enjoyed this story, we'd love for you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us and motivates us to continue sharing heartwarming, inspiring stories almost every day.